Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to discuss something called Nonviolent Communication, or abbreviated to NVC. And joining me to discuss this and shed some light on it, to enlighten us, is Ron DeBrito. Ron, thank you for taking the time to join me today, and a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
So, Ron, maybe you could start off by maybe just introducing yourself and giving us a brief sort of intro as to how you discovered this thing called nonviolent communication. And then, of course, we'll sort of define it and thrash it out and see what it is.
Well, nonviolent communication was a massive gift for me. I came across it at a time in my life where there was a lot of grief and stress, and I was just introduced to it by a friend, and from there I ended up going to camps, and the benefit of that was attending lots of different workshops and finding out bit by bit whatever I could absorb about how NVC might work, and learning layer by layer about 10 years ago. And it's just grown in me, something that I wanted to internalize and make a part of my life quite consciously, which isn't easy. I will say that at the beginning, trying to bring lots of different skills into everyday life. But that has been my aim all the time, and it supports me in everything that I do. I do my best to show up with a non-violent approach to things, and to be kind to myself as well, so I can communicate within and with the world.
So would you say that nonviolent communication is essentially a communication skill and perhaps partly personal development tool? How would you describe it? Maybe we can, put a label on it, and then we'll start to get into the nitty-gritty.
Well, I think it covers quite a lot of bases. I think that's what makes it such a valuable skill, because it helps the way you communicate with yourself and with others. And it also helps you to the way that you are in the world. Because, well, what it does right at the beginning is begin to say that if we stick with traditional ideas of right and wrong and good and bad, then we tend to get more distant from each other. And the whole purpose of NVC is about connecting. And we all know this, that when we get into disagreements with people, we tend to get further away, and no one can hear anybody because they're frustrated and in pain, that sort of thing.
I'm a father of 3 young children, and I have noticed in my own sort of communications as a dad, there have been ups and downs, and I often get things wrong and end up sort of creating or compromising, I should say, creating separation between myself and my children, and ultimately compromising my relationship with them, which I see as, my number one, possibly only tool of influence over their lives, is this wonderful thing called our relationship. And I potentially see something like nonviolent communication as maybe helping me be more mindful in communication such as that. So I'm thinking that perhaps one of the key benefits for listeners could be something similar along those lines. But I guess from what you're saying, it probably has a lot of other benefits too.
Well, you've picked a hard one there, because in our traditional lives, children tend to be given a role that doesn't afford them the kind of respect that we give to other adults. That they tend to be considered as small because they are small, and therefore that we have authority over them. And it does make it quite difficult to bring NVC in. It takes longer to resolve things by giving the child loads of choice, because choice is a really important part of NVC. I guess you're finding that listening to understand your children is way better than listening to tell them what you think you want them to do instead. And that there already is a way of being more relaxed and sweet and gentle and connected to them. rather than just telling them what to do. And I'm sure that is much more heartwarming, and to engage with them differently.
I'm aware that telling children what to do, it can be very counterproductive, but obviously we want to try and guide them, and so that's it's a tricky path that I think all parents walk, isn't it? So
Yes.
so let's rip into nonviolent communication then. Am I right in saying that Marshall Rosenberg was the guy that sort of coined the phrase and
Yes.
and started off this idea? Perhaps you could pick it up from there and sort of give us an overview of the concept of the idea, and perhaps I can just sort of interject and sort of pick around,
Sure.
and we can thrash it
Sure.
out.
Yeah. Well, Marshall was a true inspiration, and he was influenced by Carl Rogers. He grew up in Detroit where there were race riots, and he kind of got to noticing how differently people behaved, that some people were universally kind and willing to contribute to others, and some people were not like that, that they tended to act in ways that gave rise to violent behavior and violent actions. And he was very curious about this. And he would say things like, I went to school for 11, 12 years, and nobody ever asked me how I was. Because, as you know, that so many systems in the world, like schools, are bent on the outcome and the product rather than who's doing it and how those people actually are. So he became very curious. And even after he'd done his degree in psychology, he said, I still didn't find out what motivates people either to be kind and generous, or to be more destructive in their actions, So he got very curious, and gradually he started to put together something that had a structure. The structure is really wonderful because it's great to have some kind of container or sense of where we're trying to be at. And as I said before, that's about connecting and allowing our attention to be on being present. Because so often when we communicate, we can do it where we're not really listening to you because actually there's something interesting going on over there, and maybe I ought to be fixing something else over there, and I'm not giving you my full presence. And actually, that's quite hard to do because we do live in a world that's multitasking a lot. So one of the things is to bring our attention to stay connected with our communications and people we want to communicate with, to put our attention onto presence and compassion. That's a beautiful framework from which he came up with ideas about how we could talk to each other that didn't involve standard traditional ways that we have all learned, such as judging, blaming, and criticizing. And he could see what happened when we did those things. We get more distant. And as soon as we judge or blame or criticize, which are completely normalized in all of our societies, the person who hears that kind of language tends to stop listening to us. They're not hearing something that feels lovely. They're hearing something that kind of closes them off. They no longer want to communicate. So if we want to stay in connection with others, finding different language enables us to do that. I love to begin the way I teach this with feelings. Feelings are really the second component of nonviolent communication. But every time I meet someone, they're feeling something. They know how they are right now in this moment. So I love that because before I even try to teach anybody anything, I've invited them to see how they really are. What's going on for them? Are they, typically when people come to a workshop, they've been traveling or they've been, getting the children's dinner ready before they show up to a call. And it's really wonderful to begin with how are you feeling, because Marshall was able to create a huge vocabulary of feelings so that people didn't just say, well, I'm fine, I'm pretty good, not too bad, a bit low, he really increased the vocabulary through which we could describe how we're actually feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge gift, to have different words to use, because very often in our common parlance, we use limited numbers of words to say how we're feeling. And that's marvelous, because when we know how we're feeling, we're often feeling it because there's something in our body that tells us what we're feeling. Something like our heart's beating a bit faster, or we've suddenly got tense, or our shoulders have hunched up, or when we're aware of body sensations, we start realizing how we're feeling. So, of course, the next problem with that is, how do I tell people how I'm feeling? Because other people don't talk like this.
And I guess most of the time people aren't predisposed to sort of checking in with somebody else's feelings. I mean, to be honest, I mean, my whole approach is I'm very interested in thinking skills, and I'm very rational orientated, but I can very much see the value in communicating in a way that gets the best out of people, frankly, and
Yes.
because that's in everyone's interest, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I can see that, with the judgment, criticism, etc., that you're mentioning, people tend to just clam up, don't they? People get defensive, shields come up, and you're not really likely to get a good two-way exchange as soon as people are feeling attacked. So I can see it. There's huge value in all of our social interactions if we can avoid. If we can find ways to avoid making people feel attacked.
Yes.
I notice this even if I have something of value that I want to share with somebody. It might be my wife, for example. It might be a very, very close relationship. And I experience that even though I want to share something which, from my perspective, is in her rational self-interest, this would do her good if she would listen to this, it's still very difficult to perhaps know how to frame that idea in a way that she's going to hear, this is really my interest, and I know you do counselling and stuff, and you help people in other areas too. So I think there's many ways that this can help. Now, I remember hearing from Marshall that one of the key principles of his approach is sort of trying to drop this "I'm right and you're wrong" sort of polarization approach to a conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you. I'm going to say that in my words, all right? Because when I felt a lot of curiosity with what you were saying about when you would like to contribute to your wife's well-being in such a way that she might receive it as genuine contribution. So when we think of ourselves, you've mentioned lots of things I'd like to draw out. One is how you relate with yourself and how we relate to others, because the patterns of I'm right or I'm wrong or I'm good or I'm bad are what we tend to learn within ourselves. We've learned them from somewhere and we internalize them. And this actually maps onto the way we behave towards others. And it's not that healthy, of course, as you know. So a lot of the healing of those ways of looking at ourselves comes from how we apply nonviolent communication to ourselves. How am I with myself? Am I telling myself? And this is a key part of Marshall Rosenberg's. What are you telling yourself when you want to help someone in a particular way, or you want to contribute something your way, but you haven't really listened to what they actually need? So we can jump there into the ways we interact with people, which is they're not feeling something because you made them feel it, or you're not feeling something because of something they did. People do not cause our feelings is a big principle of nonviolent communication. Our feelings arise because we either have needs that are being met, in which we have feelings of pleasure and calm and ease, or needs are not being met and we have feelings of disappointment, regret, sadness, and pain. And the thing is, Nigel, those are words that we do not use every day. So people can immediately go into defense if you say, I'm noticing that you might be feeling a bit stressed right now. Is it like that? So we do have to be careful. So while we're learning nonviolent communication, we're going to put our foot into it quite a lot, but it's always worth trying it, because I feel as though I'm constantly learning. And along the way, I found that I'm really able to contribute to my own well-being and to others. So we feel what we feel because of needs. When I'm needing something and somebody comes along and that's the thing that they're offering, maybe companionship or support, and someone is able to meet that need, suddenly I can relax. That need's been met. Oh, that's so much easier. My feelings change from being tense and worried into relaxation and calm. So those are the things, the threads that Marshall was working with. If we feel them in ourselves, then noticing how it is with other people. So when we have difficulties relating to other people, we need another skill that Marshall introduced, which is listening with empathy. Listening to really understand where they're coming from, not to tell them our way of doing it because we think that's better or more right or something like that, but simply to sit with someone and be present and let the whole of your body listen to them and get a sense of how it is to be with whatever's alive in them. So Marshall's beautiful question, what's alive in me? What's alive in you? Listening with empathy so that I really understand how it is for you, not trying to fix them.
I'm curious, how would you pitch your language? For example, if you know somebody who is an alcoholic, or perhaps they smoke too much, or something that's fairly obviously not in their interest, and somebody may be in a position where they have knowledge and they're trying to share that knowledge with somebody, not out of any gain for the person that's saying it, because it would benefit that person. How then do we reconcile that with not being right? How do we couch that sort of message? Obviously, well, not obviously, but for people who might smoke too much or drink too much, it's not easy to stop. I mean, we kind of all get that. But we also all get maybe that we can certainly see. I'm only using that as an example. We can see that that's an example of something that they would do well to sort of listen about. So you get what I'm saying. How would we broach such a tricky kind of issue?
That is a marvelous question. I would like to address the fact that the part of us that thinks we could be on the right track or have more useful knowledge is usually the left hemisphere of the brain. And that what I personally, this is not Marshall's approach, but I think he used it, although he didn't write about it, is to include the entire nervous system and the whole body's sensations and relationship within, with the gut, the heart, the belly, relationship with the right hemisphere of the brain. It's the left hemisphere, and that's its job. So I'm not saying it's a bad guy. I'm saying the left hemisphere is responsible for thinking, analyzing, sorting, comparing, judging. It's supposed to do that, and it does that to help us. Unfortunately for humans, we can get a little bit carried away with the left hemisphere of the brain and think it can do everything. So what I'm inviting, I personally, a relationship between the left brain that knows when it's listening to someone, my God, they would really benefit from that course I just heard about down the road. Or my goodness, this person clearly needs some support. Or wouldn't it be great if this person could talk to someone who had some real skill that could really help them? And to know that those things are going on our brains, but not say them. So to have a relationship with our heart and our gut and grow this loving relationship. And that's certainly what I'm about and the way I use NVC in my life. So when we listen with our heart to a person who's struggling with an addiction, instead of looking at the symptom of the addiction, we might have read some other books and listened to some other talks. This person is suffering. They're reaching for this thing because they're in pain and they're hurting. And this is obviously drowning those feelings out so they don't feel the pain. So maybe from a nonviolent communication perspective, if we could listen to that person's pain, because if we say to them, you're drinking a lot, do you maybe need some support? They'll go, yeah, they'll agree with you. Yes, of course, I know I'm drinking too much. Or if they disagree with you, then they stop listening. It's not that they don't know intellectually that they're drinking too much. It's that they're suffering, which they're trying to drown out because they actually haven't got a way to be with that pain. So if we can bring empathy to their pain and let them know that we hear it, we know it's there. It must be so painful for you. Well, it's about listening. Noticing something they're actually saying that we can observe, and this is the first component of nonviolent communication, is noticing what happens without judging it. So it could be hard to think of an example off the top of my head, but noticing something about the person and being empathic towards what's hurting them. And forgetting about the fact that, of course, we know a really skilled person or Alcoholics Anonymous or a therapist, or we know lots of things. But actually, until that person can start relating with their own pain inside them and to be held with that pain and not to feel alone with it, they can't address it. So actually, unless they're ready and they say to you, do you know what? I am so tired of the way I keep drinking to drown out my sorrows, literally drown out my sorrows. It's killing me. My liver's terrible, whatever. What could I do? Then it might, if they ask you, and this is something that Marshall talked a lot about, empathy isn't giving advice. Because when you give advice, what we do is we undermine that person's power and agency to take action for themselves. So things that are really healing are where when people are really heard, and this is a deep basic need, when you really listen and they feel that you've listened and they can go, that I just got so much pain inside me. I don't know where to go with it. Well, then they then have the empowerment to go, actually, now I see it now. Now I can sign up for a course or whatever it is. I feel ready to step out and do something.
But maybe I can ask you what you think with, there's a saying, how much suffering do you need? Obviously suffering for many human beings is the only teacher that they'll listen to. And I get what you're saying about sort of empathizing with someone's suffering, but it would almost seem that perhaps it's best not to attempt to communicate with someone until they actually ask you, as it were. I kind of get that. Obviously people are receptive to something when they're proactively inquiring, rather than having stuff rammed down their throats.
Yes,
but it isn't always appropriate to wait. This. Just thinking of the reality of life. There are all sorts of circumstances we all find ourselves in, but of course there are some where maybe waiting until that person is ready, it might not be the best thing. But anyway, that's I guess that's a kind of a judgment call in every situation, isn't it?
We're always going to have that, and some people don't survive, as we know. And that's really painful. So some of the things we could say to someone who, in our example could be, I really care about you. I feel a lot of warmth about you. I'd so love to contribute to your well-being. Is there something that I could do to support you? To let them know that you care, for instance. That would be a generous way of saying, you know, I'm really sensing that that life's a bit hard for you right now. You know, is there a sort of open request? I'd love to be. So that would be a need of yours, not that. I'd love to contribute to you in some way.
Yeah. I like that idea of you know, I mean, it bringing more consciousness to framing the message, essentially, isn't it? And okay, I guess it might take some tiptoeing around the edges, and obviously, you know, if people feel understood, if people feel that you get them and what they're going through, I mean, that is a great connection, isn't it? And they're quite likely to maybe open up more and maybe even ask you for some of that advice, if it's an advice giving situation.
I think actually that's undeniable, that providing people with warmth, empathy, understanding, kindness and care will be a quicker route, actually, will support them sufficiently, whilst we do feel scared at the same time that they won't get there and they won't get help. So thank you for that.
I'm curious also about Marshall Rosenberg's language, because he speaks of jackal language and giraffe language, and you know, in one of his most famous presentations in San Francisco, I remember seeing some time ago, you know, he has these glove puppets and he's got a jackal and a giraffe, which he uses to illustrate the points he makes. Can you give us a flavor of what he means by jackal language, or I suppose the kind of language that we should perhaps avoid if we're seeking to, you know, create the most beneficial communication between ourselves and somebody else? Language that's best avoided, and the other language, the giraffe language, as he called it, which is more appropriate perhaps for you know, better communication, getting the best out of people. Can you expand on those, on the language thing that he uses?
I'm really glad you asked me that. I adore the jackals because so I'll explain that. I've got my puppets actually in a cupboard over there, so I use them a lot. So when Marshall talks about jackal language, this is a place where someone is experiencing really difficult feelings. They're in a lot of pain and they're upset and stressed and anxious and scared and so on. And they don't know how to talk about their feelings and needs. So the way that they express it in order to try to protect themselves from all this pain that they're feeling is to say it in judgmental ways, to blame, to lash out, to compare. I'm no good, you're much better than me. To label, that guy's an idiot, or I'm an idiot, okay? So the jackal language, which includes those moralistic judgments of I'm right and you're wrong, I'm bad and you're good, labeling people, comparing, threatening and punishments, demands. These are the things that we do. We already do them. And it's actually great to name that we notice that's what we already do. And the jackal is really there to say, oh God, that hurts so much. I'm going to lash it out. I'm going to blame someone else, because for me to feel that pain is just awful. And I think that understanding that the jackal doesn't yet know a better way. And Marshall described this as tragic expressions of unmet needs. So the jackal language is where we use judging, blaming, criticizing, and so on as tragic ways of expressing our needs because we don't know how to say it any better. So when we feel all these painful things that we feel, and to say, oh my gosh, this is really hurting me, and I see that I'm blaming myself or I'm blaming that person there because the pain inside me is just unspeakable. And this is very classic, Nigel, because in our society, if we're not able to talk about how we feel, and we're not able to talk about when things are painful, those things stay in our bodies and they just keep hurting, like they're not processed. And often people accumulate quite a lot of pain without ever being able to say something about it. And then we develop patterns like lashing out, or we blame ourselves and we end up feeling more pain inside of ourselves. So we do those things. It's really great to name them and then say, well, that's my jackal. That's my old friend, the jackal, trying to protect me from all this pain. And he's saying it in such a way because he's not connected to needs. And then we can begin to bring compassion to that, to bring the giraffe into that, the compassionate language, and say, oh, sweetheart, of course you're suffering. You have been so worried about your job and how to ask your manager for conditions that suit you better. It's really been upsetting you for such a long time. Of course you feel angry or scared or worried, and you can't think of a way to express it. So the giraffe can sort of come and meet this jackal self trying to express and say, yeah, you're feeling like that. Of course you are, because you really are longing for some mutuality, some direct communication, some support, some recognition, respect, affirmation, acknowledgement of how tough it is when you go to work each day and you put all your energy out and you don't receive appreciation, things like that. So the giraffe can bring more the language of understanding feelings because of unmet needs and say what those needs are. Does that make sense? And I think they're both so valuable.
Yep.
I think because the transformation from the jackal language to softening in the heart, to bring in what Marshall called the divine energy and relax and say, yeah, let's bring the giraffe in to sort of lavish compassion on how I am right now and help me to understand the needs that I have or the other person.
Is there some kind of resource where people can get a flavour of this giraffe language, ways to phrase, is there sort of some resource, where you can, not literally learn the vocabulary, but the ways of phrasing things? Yes. Is there such a resource? Because obviously that sounds interesting, and people are going to be thinking, well, okay, give me more, tell me more. People might want more precise information. I mean, but before you answer that, maybe you can also speak to something that was this Marshall Rosenberg presenting, making requests rather than demands.
Yes.
Maybe presenting your desire for somebody to do something as a request, in terms of our way that we phrase it, the phraseology of our language, rather than making it sound like it's a demand and you must do it.
Yes.
So I guess that's kind of an example of this language. So again, is there a resource, or how can people get a flavour of the lingo?
Yeah, that's very beautiful. And actually, that's what takes the practice. So when Marshall spoke about nonviolent communication, he used the components of observation when this thing happened, something that actually happened without any judgment or blame when you came home from work, that type of thing. I felt something because I needed, and expressing that need. And the request, Marshall always suggested that the person that is receiving the request could hear it as a choice. And he used the words, would you be willing to help me with the washing up, perhaps, or to help me carry stuff in from the car? Would you be willing? Now, would you be willing is a great way of inviting the person to check whether they really are willing. The trouble with that can be when they say, well, no, I'm not willing because I've got other stuff to do. So Marshall introduced more around requests, around if someone says no, they've got some other needs going on that are somehow bigger for them than helping you bring stuff in from the car, and how to have empathy for that. maybe to say, gosh, I guess you've got something going on that's really pressing for you. He would continue to ask, So maybe I'm a bit desperate, actually, about having some help right now. I wonder if, I hear your no, and I really respect that. But also, I'm a bit frantic about getting all this stuff in. I wonder maybe if you could still find a way to support me at this moment, but to say it in such a way that they still know they have choice, that they can say, no, that's not for me. And there are different kinds of requests to connect. Would you be up for having a chat with me? So Marshall also introduced something which he calls street giraffe, which is ordinary ways of saying the same things that have the same meaning, but ways in which people you're talking to won't feel that you're doing a technique to them, because they don't generally enjoy that. Resources for that. Well, it really helps to practice these things over time, because the things that we've talked about often take a long time to really bring them into our everyday language. And actually, it is often that learning a new vocabulary is what it's about. And we're not used to it. And so there are several trainers throughout the UK who hold trainings and practice groups in which people can try out things that are happening to them on a day-to-day basis. And say going to a practice group once a week with a small number of people, and everybody gets a chance to say, well, this is what happened to me, and then translating that into nonviolent language. When this happened, I was feeling because I needed, and I really was longing for this person to help me in such and such a way. And all the time we practice, we're getting to know our own feelings better, our own patterns, the ways that we are, the ways that suit people and don't suit them. We hear whether people feel great about what we're asking, or whether they say, oh, you suddenly started talking a weird language. I don't want to hear that. Don't do your technique on me. And that's real. And to come into ourselves and find our own inner resources. So matching those resources with many trainers that you can find on the NVC UK website. And that will help to find people that suit the way that we are, and that use the language in a way that works for us. I work as a personal coach, and most people approach me because I use nonviolent communication, and that's what they need. People that come to me are often dealing with their own inner turmoils, working with people, living with other human beings, neighbors, relationships, work.
I suppose it's always context specific, isn't it? Like everything in life. Sometimes if there's an emergency situation, you might have to just be a little bit more direct and not sort of, what some people might say, pussyfoot around with someone. Yeah. But on the other hand, if this is a delicate situation, if it's a delicate relationship, if it's a critical issue, if there's no hurry, and I suppose these are all things that we have to bring into our awareness, aren't they? Bring into that whole context about each particular communication. Is this a communication with a child? Is this a communication with a work colleague? Is this a communication with a friend who's perhaps let you down or something, or your partner? I mean, all of these contexts are going to be unique, aren't they? And obviously there's no formula for every single approach, but it's principles, isn't it? If we can use the principles of not trying to make people wrong, as you say, trying to speak with empathy, as though you understand where they're coming from, and trying to invite people into a particular course of action with a request rather than a demand. I mean, this really does sound like quite universally practical and useful techniques for interacting with other human beings.
Yes.
Which leads me to my next question. Who is it for, do you think, NVC? I mean, obviously it must help you with your coaching. I can see a benefit for parents. I can see a benefit in many situations. But can you give us your take on who do you think might best benefit from this kind of approach, and perhaps even what kind of circumstances do you think it might be most useful in?
Well, I'm very biased because I think NVC can be adapted for many, many things that we need. And I think this is the beauty of Marshall's work, because whether it's just me sitting with myself going, I feel so alone, and I'm longing for some companionship, and I feel too tired to actually reach out myself, I can give myself empathy. I can say, of course you're too tired to reach out. You're so longing for someone to just ring you up. So it really does help with personal development hugely, because we can see the relationships between our behavior and what we're feeling inside, the way we express things, how we ask people for help, and we can change from judging and blaming into being more gentle and kind and just saying, oh yeah, I understand how it is for you, and I'm feeling, when you say that, I feel really soft. With work colleagues, people often come to me with work issues about a relationship at work. Their manager has perhaps presented things in quite a demanding way, and there's a need to be acknowledged for what we're already doing. And it's not about changing the situation, but by understanding it differently with empathy for oneself and what we're experiencing in that difficult work relationship, helps us to make doable requests. Of course, the requests need to be something, if it is for an action, to maybe approach the manager and say, look, this is what's going on for me. I'm really bothered by it, and I'd kind of love to, you have a chat with me after work or something like that. It also helps to really assert your own sense of presence and being, to stay honest and authentic to oneself. This is really valuable, so that we feel less the fact that people are, trying to make us do what they want. Marshall had loads of examples of how he used NVC with his children, and they're often quite entertaining and valuable. And yes, we might adapt the language and use it differently for today, but it certainly helps to not see things as a dead end, the end of the road, there's nowhere to go, the whole relationship's fallen apart, but to stay with our feelings and what they're telling us about what we're really needing. And to be aware that sometimes we're sort of kind of bent that our partner or the chap we've worked with has got to be the person that helps with those needs, and to notice that those needs are ours and that maybe they can be met some other way, and it doesn't rely on this person being the only strategy for meeting what we need, and to have some openness as well. It's so supportive to stay with our authenticity, to stay grounded and to be our own person, and to show up that way in our relationships and at work and the world, the wider world. To bring NVC to organizations and systems would be very fantastic, and that is being done little by little in different ways.
Where can people find out more? You've already mentioned nvc.co.uk, was it? Perhaps you can remind us of the website, and also any other resources or pointers for where people might who might be interested could learn more.
So the website is www.nvc-uk.com. And there you will find a list of all of the trainers and all of the people that work in NVC in the UK. It's great to go and click on specific people that maybe live in your area and find out what they're doing. Are they holding workshops? Have they done any talks? And there is a vast range of trainers around the world, many of whom Training English, where we'll find lots of different approaches and ways of being, and that's really helpful.
So you are one of the NVC UK trainers yourself, I take it, and people could come to you. Maybe by way of wrapping it up, if of course if there's anything else that we've not yet said about NVC, please do chime in. But otherwise, how can people maybe reach out to you and further with what you do?
Well, my website is www.rondebrito.co.uk. So that's pretty easy. And if people go on there, it describes the way that I use NVC to help people. I also, you probably realized, I use a bit more connection with the body in the way that I invite people to relate with their feelings. And so there's plenty on my website to help people find out, a few blogs and also a YouTube channel that is also Ron DeBrito. So I'm working at linking those two together, where I do short talks on the way I present the work. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Really appreciate your overview there of NVC. Thank you for bringing that to my audience. And thank you all very much for listening or indeed watching. Remember to check out the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more on there. And do join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
To see.